I have a submission here from jrwrodgers with a submission for a killer bee and grasshopper frame. We'll see if I get to both of these. No two for the price of one there, JR, even though this is free advice. So let's take a look first at the killer bee, which has the 5-inch props. It's probably going to have a little bit easier, or at least more expected tune than the 4-inch props on the grasshopper. The first thing I did is check your gyro, zoomed all the way out to 10%, and as is almost always the case these days with Betaflight and the advanced filtering on it, the gyro lines are very thin. They're not the thinnest I've ever seen, but they're certainly thin enough that your noise level on the copter is not really an issue. And that's always worth checking, but it's clearly the case. Check your roll next. We'll zoom in here. And as I look through, the D term is very noisy. There's a lot of high frequency noise on the D term. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily a problem because, as you can see, it's following the P term fairly closely. It's not super noisy, but I might think that you could try a little more filtering on the D term and see if you got better results there. You might find that the copter feels a little softer, and you might not like it, but it's certainly worth a try. It's hard to interpret the D term sometimes on the newer beta flights, whether it's doing the right thing. It certainly does have a lot of noise in it, though, and so perhaps, where's your file? Perhaps, what's it called these days? I don't even know. D term cut hertz. Yeah, so you're running D term cut hertz of 0, which sometimes that makes the copter fly well, even though the black box traces don't look good. So I'm not sure I would advise you to change that, but you might change it and see if you like the result better. It's going to be subtle, I think, if it's there at all. In order to just check your P term, let's go ahead and get rid of the D there. We'll get rid of the gyro too, and we'll just look there. And I'm just going to look for oscillations, especially at high throttle. And I certainly see some movement here. Your motors are definitely very, very active, and that's your D term probably making that noise. Again, it's debatable. You notice how the motors are very jittery here? It's debatable whether that's actually getting out to the motors because the motors have mass and have inertia, and they're going to damp that somewhat. But it's not ideal to have that going out. But it's possible that actually results in a sharper and better flight feel, even if that actually ends up wasting some energy as heat. So I'm not sure whether it's not so bad. You see how the motors, their jitter is relatively small in magnitude. They're not going from like full to 3/4 to full to 3/4, you see? So it's not super big magnitude in the jitter, but it's not great. I don't love it. I don't see any super jitter or a super oscillation here in the P term as you raise the throttle, so that's fine. We've got a roll here. This is that acro plus thing during the roll. We just got to ignore that. The PIDs are kind of, you just ignore them during the roll when you're doing acro plus. Notice we've got this moment here where the motors go from 0 to, I wonder if that's actually, I bet this is not accurate either. This motor display is not accurate either with the acro plus. I think Boris told me that, so never mind. Yeah, so no oscillations even at high throttle. Starting to get some activity here. I would try raising the P term, P gain on roll, and see if you like that better. You're at 4.0 now. 4.0 is not really high for, are you on 3S? No, you're on 4S. 4.0 is not really high for rewrite. Take it up to 5 or 5.5 and see what happens. That's what I would say. Let's take a look at pitch. D magnitude on pitch is lower. This is very interesting because your D gain, I think you have the same on roll 20 and 20. So it's very interesting that it looks so different here. It still has high frequency noise, but the magnitude is lower. I could probably dig into a mathematical explanation of that, but I don't feel like it. There's a difference in the way the weight is distributed. There's oftentimes less noise on the pitch axis, and that may be why we're seeing less activity in the D trace here, because there's less vibration. The D term amplifies noise is one of the things it does. So this is sort of showing you that all else being equal, you probably will need less D on roll than on pitch. And that goes back to the weight distribution. The weight is more centralized on the roll axis and it's more spread out on the pitch axis for the type of frame that you've got. Because the weight is spread out, it's more inherently damped and less sort of nimble, if you will. And that results in less vibration. It's a little hard to see that when we look at the trace because all of the traces sort of are very well filtered. Right here, we're getting a lot of noise here, though. In this, it's a little, I'm not sure I can explain to you why I say this, but this looks like the D trace is sort of getting noisy on its own. Do you see how it's kind of irregular? Whereas when we looked at the roll trace, the D term here looks like a high frequency signal superimposed on a lower frequency signal. We can see these short, sharp, narrow vibrations, but also we could see a lower frequency signal superimposed on it, right? Whereas when we go over where I was on the pitch axis, right here, we don't see, it's not easy to pick out a low frequency sort of line that goes, I mean, you could filter it down and get a line, but it's not as obvious. So this looks like you're a lot noisier here. And that makes me think that instead of having some high frequency noise, which is just background noise on a fundamentally useful low frequency D trace, that makes me feel like here it's just sort of garbage. And it makes me think maybe the D needs to be a little lower here as well. So and I wonder if you've gone to my thread. I wonder if you've gone through this thread, Blackbox Log video responses. No, that's the thread we're on right now. Oh my gosh, what am I doing? Mini quad PID tuning from start to finish. There you go. Because the advice I give in there is to turn I and D, but especially D, down to like 5 before you do your P tuning, and then bring D up. Okay, so I would recommend going back and working your D up again, because especially in the latest versions of Betaflight, the P term is very, very effective, and you don't need as much D term as before. And in fact, too much D term can really cause problems. There's sort of a different school of thought with the tuning. So you really just, it's like salt in a stew. You really just only want enough. But if you get too much, then it's going to be gross and nobody's going to want to eat it. Okay, so you get the point, right? So I think that, you know, in earlier versions of CleanFlight and Betaflight, the P term was not optimally effective. And so you would get P as good as you could get it, and it still wasn't good enough. And you would try and bring D up to help it out. And fortunately, because D was like heavily filtered, so it was hard for D to cause too much trouble unless you really went overboard. But now P term is super effective in the latest Betaflights, and the D term has not got a lot holding it back or filtering it, which means that you don't need a lot of D. And if you end up adding too much D, it'll cut you. Okay, and when I cut you, I mean it'll burn a motor or an ESC. And I don't think you're there, but you might be like, especially like right here. That's just a lot of noise and garbage, right? That doesn't feel like it's very useful. So I think I would bring D down, bring D on both axes down to like 5 and work it up. Leave it at 5 and fly it. Bring the P terms up until the copter gets sharp without getting excess oscillations. And if you like it at D equals 5, maybe you find that 5 or 6 or 8 is a good place for D to be for you. Like, it really feels like looking at your P term traces that you have more room to go to raise that up. We don't really see, even at like max throttle, we start to see the barest signs of some surging, but we don't see any actual cross the axis up, down, up, down, up, down oscillations. We just don't see any of them. So it's like, you know, like I use the analogy squealing tires on a race car. If somebody's out there on a racetrack and they're driving around and you don't hear the tire squeal one time, they're not going fast enough. And if you've got your P term tuned and you look through the whole trace, and you're doing max throttle, and you're doing hard descents, and you don't see one, like the beginning of an oscillation, your P-terms can come up. I mean, or just leave them where they are and fly it if you like it, obviously. But if you want my advice on what to do to sharpen it up, that's what I would say. I think your P-terms can come up on both axes. How high? I don't know, but like I said, 5.5 on roll, and potentially 6 or 7 on pitch, because pitch can usually go higher than roll. But do that with the D-terms down around 5, because the D gain down around 5, because you don't want to knock yourself off the cliff. And yaw looks okay. Yaw is tricky. Yaw is a very tricky to tune. Just looking at Blackbox, I often tune it just by feel, based on what I'm seeing going into and coming out of turns. So I'm not sure. I have a lot to say here. Your D-trace looks active, but not overactive. I like it. It's not. You haven't got it turned all the way down. That's fine. Yaw doesn't need a huge amount of D. P, it looks okay. I'd leave it alone until you get pitch and roll more dialed in, and then probably just tweak it by feel. But nothing is gratuitous there. Okay, so that's 11 minutes, and I think I'm going to leave it at that. Use that same advice on your other copter. All right, hope that was helpful. Happy flying.